But first, like you, I always thought the schools were places for teaching life's essentials: how to read, write, count, how to think, how to debate, how to engage, and for encouraging our children to be decent human beings who respected one another. And that's what they mostly have been. Certainly in my time growing up in a little class of 6 in a tiny country town in Victoria, and later a much bigger school in Geelong. But that was 30 years ago. You've got to worry now, don't you, about how things will turn out, with so many young people being taught not to respect our country and our history, not to be proud and confident in themselves, but to be ashamed of Australia and to see themselves as repositories of so-called white privilege among all these other ideological concepts that we're loading onto them at an age when our standing in international educational rankings are falling dramatically, despite the billions and billions that you as taxpayers spend on education in this country. Now, I'm not going to pretend that there haven't been shameful episodes in Australia's past, as there are in the past of all countries and all people. No one gets it right all the time. But it's dangerous to judge history through the prism of today. And on balance, our country is as good as any and better than most. Our system of justice has always aspired to be colourblind, and has largely been the case, at least since the 1830s, when whites were first hanged for the murder of blacks at Myall Creek in New South Wales. And no one can doubt the efforts made over the past few decades to ensure that Aboriginal people are helped to take a rightful place of honour as Australians' first Australians. As a society, we've never been less racist. That's not what school kids are being taught through so-called white privilege training in New South Wales public schools, as revealed in today's Daily Telegraph. Indeed, you've got to wonder just how much parents even understand about what's happening in the classrooms before they read the paper this morning. That in itself, this disengagement of parents, is part of the problem. Parents knowing far too little about what really goes on inside the classroom, and too often it's the preserve of the teacher who won't tell, and the poor old kids who can't usually tell the difference between teaching and indoctrination. That's why a sensible, balanced curriculum and carefully calibrated programs are essential if our children aren't going to end up brainwashed by activists, or being susceptible to it at the very least. Occasionally, though, stuff seeps out. Like today's revelations in the Telegraph, the New South Wales school children, starting from kindergarten, are being exposed to lesson plans from an education bureaucracy led by a website called Racism No Way, claiming that governments, quote, silence the true history of Australia because they don't want to face uncomfortable truths about the past, or, quote, acknowledge that Australia is only the lucky country for a select few. Naturally, students are asked to consider whether we should change our flag. There's even a lesson plan called Got White Privilege, ? That teaches kids that white people have unearned advantages that they must reject so that they don't continue to reinforce our present hierarchies. You can believe it all. It's all there on the website. I am not making this up. 99% of this is absolute claptrap, but New South Wales Education Minister Sarah Mitchell, well, she's resisting calls today to can this website, as reported in the Daily Telegraph, which brings me to another problem, one you've heard me highlight a fair bit lately. I can understand how left-wing social engineering can slip into schools without a minister's knowledge, but when it's exposed, why don't these ministers act? What's the point of having a Liberal National Coalition government that might spend a little less and regulate a little less than Labor, but that's incapable of reining in the political correctness that Labor fosters in all the cultural institutions that shape how people feel about our country? You know, I'm an admirer of Gladys Berejiklian, and I think that the New South Wales government has been by far the best when it comes to fighting this pandemic, whilst preserving at least a semblance of an economy. That said, it's still a government with an environment minister that belongs in the Greens, and that's Mr Matt Keane, and as evidence of that, he's just appointed his mate Malcolm Turnbull head of the New South Wales Zero Emissions Advisory Board, thus creating a permanent critic of the federal Liberal government's energy policy. The former Labor federal minister said to me the other night, when he heard this, he said, well, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Matt Keane. That takes care of the next election for Labor. That's the real problem here facing the coalition around the country, isn't it? We don't elect right-wing parties to do left-wing things. This is the lesson that Liberal governments forget at their peril. Just look at WA. Just look at the WA Liberals trying to out-green Labor and ending up with the biggest anti-Liberal landslide in history. Not even enough Liberals in the Parliament to be the official opposition party in Western Australia. Now, I don't imagine that Premier Berejiklian or Prime Minister Scott Morrison, for that matter, could ever be as stupid as Zach Kirkup was, but McKean's not much better. And in politics, things can change quickly. As the Prime Minister, of course, is only just finding out. Liberal governments aren't elected to just be slightly more competent than Labor ones. They're elected and re-elected to move the country in the right direction wherever they can. Being Labor light is a betrayal of the people who work hard to put them there, who vote for them, who support them. People like me who worked in opposition to get them into government. So I'm sorry, you can't expect us not to notice this sort of behaviour in New South Wales. And it's not something on this program I'm prepared to let them get away with now or in the future.